Yes, what is the story? We are back after the international break. It is myself, Nosy, one half of the FPL Draft Joe. In today's Game Week 4 preview, we are going to go through everything that happened in the international break, look at some of the dilemmas we looked at Game Week 3, do a really, really deep dive into midfielders, their ceiling versus their nailedness, and then go through our waivers. So let's get into it. First section up, as always, is Jaxie's stats section. He's done a deep dive into international minutes, and we're going to have a look at players who played significant minutes or maybe reduced minutes over the international break. First and foremost, we have some midfielders that play majority of minutes for their clubs. That's McAllister, Enzo. We have Bruno Guimaraes, Paqueta, Diaz, Lerma, all played significant minutes for their international teams away on duty. It's interesting to think about who might get rested out of those. Is there a possibility of Enzo Fernandez getting rested? McAllister did pick up a knock, so he's probably more likely to get rested than anyone. And Diaz, 90 minutes in both games, has been ripping it up for Liverpool. I know he's been getting the kind of slightly early substitutions, but is there a possibility that maybe he doesn't get the start at the weekend? I wouldn't be too worried as an owner. You know, you're still going to keep him for the rest of the season, but one to keep an eye on. Um, Other players like Munoz, 90 minutes in both games. Again, probably going to play the majority of minutes for Palace as well. Um, Players that played reduced minutes out of this cohort: Garnacho only 11 minutes away on international duty. We have João Pedro, who only played 45 minutes in the second game. One other player, John Duran, got an assist away on international duty. If you are in a big league, Duran isn't a bad option as a third choice striker. Play him some days. The problem with Duran is you're probably going to have to play him every day because how he scores is coming on and banging late on. Um, so if you're in a 16 manager league, um, and you don't have great fixtures, maybe Duran start him could be a decent shout. It's a pity he didn't go to a big team, but yeah, it's interesting to see who will play. Maybe Diaz gets the rest, Enzo Fernandez possibly. The rest I expect to start for their teams. Next cohort of people, and we can see some unfortunate colours here. Let's pick them out first. Fulkrug picked up an Achilles injury. He's at 25%. And it's probably, as Jaxie has in at the end, a nice time to maybe waiver him out. Last week, I expected him to get the start. I thought he'd be eased in. Still hasn't started. And Antonio had a decent game against City for all he could do. Maybe we might see other players go up top, which we'll talk about later on. But yeah, really, really disappointing start from Fulkrug in terms of the minutes and output and the injury now. So I can 100% understand people getting rid. Ake, another person that got injured over the international break, um, stretchered off. Don't know how long that one was, but it's a no return date so far. So if you do own a City defender, it might be slightly better for you. Unfortunately, if you owned Ake, he has to go. Looking at other players who got a lot of minutes, straight up the top there, Sabazlai, 90 minutes both games. Havertz, 90 minutes both games. Gakpo, around 150 minutes. Van Dijk, 90 minutes both games. Verbruggen, De Ligt, Xerxes played the second game. And luckily for Timber, he only played 33 minutes in the second game. And Calafiori has picked up a slight injury, so that actually might bode well for Timber owners. Looking at the bottom section, Cucurella only played 56 minutes, great. Also, Gusto is injured, so I'm trying to think who's going to play right back inverted, or they might invert Cucurella from the left back position, and let's say Fofana, Colwill, and then maybe Disasi might get in there for the centre backs. There's a chance. I thought about this as your man Viega, the left back, starting, and then maybe Cucurella inverting from the right back. I wouldn't be looking out for any of them Chelsea assets that might start. Now, I would be looking at Colwill and Fofana for the nice run they have, but yeah, Cucurella more than likely going to start. Um, Rodri's back 59 minutes in the second game. Saliba, as usual, flat out 90 minutes. We have Digne down for 90 minutes in the second game, started for France. Played okay. It was a tough game for him, but back in with the French squad. As you know, we cannot um, suggest Digne because he is our arch enemy. but he is playing well, and we'll talk about him later on in the podcast. De Bruyne played 90 minutes in both games, and I watched the second game. These games are pretty intense. Like, I thought De Bruyne, 90 minutes both game, that's the last thing that he needs. But there could be a chance that he gets benched at the weekend, which we'll talk about at the end. Other players, Tillemans, Onana, majority of minutes. Doku played a very good chunk, as he always does with Belgium. And then Faze plays 90 minutes in both. Some of the players might be relevant to your squad. I think some of the main issues are, I suppose, the injuries and maybe the Digne start for France. And more importantly, De Bruyne 90 minutes both games. Final section, and unfortunately, it is dominated by that red colour in the middle there. Odegaard and Konza picking up injuries, and I think the most common or the most talked about aspect of the international break, unfortunately, was Odegaard's injury, especially in FPL, anyways. And some people say it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks. If you have Odegaard, when we talk about the midfielder section, maybe going for one of those more solid picks that I'm going to talk about might help you, because you can't leave him off. No one's going to trade for him. You're going to have to hold on to Odegaard, which might change tactics for your waivers. A really high upside waiver that you were looking at might have to go to a solid waiver that's going to play every game week if you have to keep Odegaard on your bench. Konza's a drop. You can replace Konza. That's okay. Unfortunate, but it's okay. Other players, Bruno Fernandes, 290 minutes and banged a goal. Neto, more minutes into the legs and not injured. But Bernardo Silva, 390 minutes for City so far. Nice returning. And he's one of those players that if he can play like 80% of minutes, I'd be delighted with 80% of minutes for Bernardo Silva. He will have a nice return by the end of it. He'll come away with, honestly close to 20 goals and assists for the season, even if he plays only 70, 80% of the minutes. So he'd be definitely one I'd be keeping an eye on. Now, they do have De Bruyne and Foden flag, so maybe it's a good week for him. When the season is up and running, that's when the issue starts with Bernardo Silva. But for now, great pick. Tonali, 290 minutes, which tells me that he's ready to go and start for Newcastle, and they'll be a big factor in the podcast, one player in particular. And then the likes of Kulusevski, Isaac, all got minutes into the legs, and Haaland, 290 minutes. Never need to worry about that, man. So some of the takeaways that Jaxie has formed based on the international break is players that play well over the international break might have an inflated value, and they might be good options to trade for. He reckons Grealish, Gakpo. I agree. Grealish might be a good low-level pick for a large-size league. But again, if someone thinks Grealish is going to get in consistently and doesn't think of the likes of Savio and Foden and Gundogan and De Bruyne, all these players that are eventually going to come back into that team, maybe it's a good time to get him, to get a trade over the line. I think it's not a bad time to get him specifically, because that could be a player that starts maybe in place of a De Bruyne, or a Gundogan would be a great waiver in this week for a 1 week punt. Jaxie has said, like, if there's any one game week for a 1 week punt for a City player, today or this week might be that week. Again, it's impossible to predict, but Grealish or Gundogan for a 1 week punt based on international minutes could be a decent option. Long term, not great. Trading, as he said, is a great time over the international break later on, because if that player has scored for their international team, that might be playing into the manager's minds and say, oh, geez, he might get back in that team. Often, managers don't look at international minutes or goals. It's fairly separate. So, again, if a player bangs in the both games, it doesn't necessarily mean he's going to get back into his Premier League team. Also, obviously, consider the injuries, consider minutes, consider where they played. If they played over in South America and it was a long flight and they're coming back on a Wednesday and they're playing on a Saturday, be very, very considerate of that. So any of those international or South American players that played 90 minutes both games, that might be a rotation risk. Maybe this is the week that they're going to get benched. And yeah, international break gives us a good opportunity for maybe a 1 week punt if we have space for it in our team. We are revisiting some of the players that we looked at last week and assessing them now now that the transfer deadline is over. Nkunku, a lot of people, including myself, are getting rid of Nkunku. He's never going to reach the heights that we thought he would, but I think he's better than a random waiver. I think if you have him in your team as a fourth or a fifth choice midfielder, he will come back into it. His minutes after 3 game weeks look terrible, but he's not as bad as that makes out. He's not going to be that asset that we thought, as I said, but I don't know if he's a waiver pile. Depending on the league size, obviously, if you're in a small size league, you're not going to have Nkunku. In a large size league, I still think he could be a decent option going forward if you have that available spot to take a risk with. Trippier, on the other hand, I think Trippier is probably a good one to trade because I don't think he's going to get back in there consistently. I think he will get minutes. I think he'll get a good chunk of minutes. But one, I think Livermento will play a good chunk. Two, I think he's injury prone. And three, there is still a possibility that he goes in January. So maybe getting a trade over the line with him in it could be a good option. If he starts next game week, even better, because someone might think, oh, he's back in. And it could be a good option for a while, but I think there's too many question marks over him to value him really, really highly. Darwin, Gakpo, I think they're both drops. They're never going to play consistently, and not with the way Liverpool are currently playing. At some point in the season, yeah, and a lot of people are really, really afraid to get rid of Darwin. But if you're in a small size league and there's a decent playing striker, it's genuinely worth it. He will come on and score some goals and break your heart, but I think the headache of starting him versus not starting him is not worth it. And it's similar for Gakpo. Even though Gakpo might get a start because of Diaz's minutes over the international break, I still don't think either of them are worth keeping. If you can somehow swindle them in a trade, decent. And then Walker, we said give him one more week. I think it's mainly the way Rico Lewis is playing. I don't care if Walker gets back in there because I don't think he can get back in there consistently. Rico Lewis, another assist as far as I'm aware, game week 3. He's just miles ahead of him in terms of possession. And we know the way Pep plays. I talked about Walker previously that he might play some of the bigger games, but you probably don't want that. So I think Walker now drop, Darwin now drop, Trippier now trade, and Nkunku could be um, a low level hold or maybe a bit of a risky midfielder to take a punt on if you have him. Okay, before I get into the main part, which, as you can see in the back here, is talking about ceiling versus nailedness for midfielders, we have to look at the best fixture run for the next 6 game weeks. Because I suppose for waivers, that's probably a good chunk. Yes, there's going to be gems there that are long term, but I think 6 game weeks for a waiver, a general waiver, and then short term, like let's say at the top there, Aston Villa. They play Everton, Wolves, and Ipswich 3 in a row. That's a nice short-term waiver. But after that, they do play United, Fulham, and Bournemouth. So 5 out of those 6 great fixtures. This is what we have to use, and this is one of the main things that we're going to use when we're picking waivers. If we go down the list, Ipswich are second. They play Southampton, West Ham, Everton, and Brentford. They're all as the green fixtures. You could probably take maybe a Southampton and an Everton the way they're playing. But the player that I'm going to talk about for Ipswich, remember that these are probably not green fixtures for them. Every fixture is minimum grey, if not red. Everton have a really good run of fixtures, but we know what they're like. They do play Leicester, Ipswich, and Fulham in that run. Fulham playing very well. So again, some of these green fixtures can be deceiving. Coming down the list, West Ham, some nice fixtures in there. Palace, Leicester next game week. They have Forest in a couple of game weeks' time. They kind of intermitted decent fixtures and an okay side. United play Southampton and Crystal Palace in the next 2 games. Leicester have a nice run, probably one of the nicer runs. Chelsea, we have them 4 games in a row. Bournemouth, West Ham, Brighton, Forest. Brighton, we have 2 very, very good fixtures in a row. So again, this is a kind of short-term punts that we're going to talk about. Brighton, Ipswich, and Forest. And then Fulham, decent side, playing well, playing West Ham, Newcastle, and Forest 3 in a row. So when we're looking at these midfielders, when we're looking at the waivers, this is what we're going to base them off. Villa, Ipswich maybe, Everton, West Ham, Palace, and maybe some Leicester and Chelsea boys. Fixtures aren't everything, but when we're looking through the waiver pile and trying to, essentially separate one from the other, It's one of the main things that we are going to look at, as well as how good are the team, what position are the player playing, and how well are the team playing. How well, like let's say when I look at Fulham, I think Fulham are a really good side, and when I see people playing Fulham, usually you'd attack that fixture. They're actually a very well organized side. So we have to take how they've been playing and how they're set up this year into account as well. Okay, on to our main section of the podcast, and we're talking about midfielders specifically, and we're talking about their ceiling versus their nailedness. And essentially, what that is ceiling is on any given day, what is the probability of them going off? What's the probability of them getting a 15-point return? If it's a low ceiling, they might get a goal with some bonus. Their team, and I'll use the examples that I have on here. Let's take a Dwight McNeil for instance. His ceiling is fairly low because Everton are not performing well. He's playing as a winger. He doesn't have penalties. He does have some nice routes to points, which is free kicks. And he's a decent pick, but he's never going to bang a hat trick. So compared to a Haaland, obviously his ceiling is very low. He is 100% nailed though. He's going to start most games and play 90 minutes most times for Everton. So I'm going to talk about waivers, I'm going to talk about trades all in this section, and I'm going to use players and I suppose areas of this chart as an example. Um, I'm going to start with players that are nailed, and I'm going to kind of caveat that with when I was talking about Odegaard. If you need to keep Odegaard on your bench, maybe a McNeil, although it's not too exciting, could be a smart decision. So other players that are in similar position, relatively low ceilings, but relatively nailed, well down the list. And I suppose, again, I have it done from 50% minutes, right, all the way to near 100. I have Dwight McNeil well down the list. And all these players in this section are from, let's say, 80 to 100% of minutes they'll play. Their ceiling is probably going to be low to just on the medium side. Dwight McNeil is probably the most nailed, and we have other players like Onana, slightly less nailed, but probably a slightly higher ceiling. Better team playing for Villa. Diaz, and that's Brereton Diaz for Southampton. Again, might play slightly less minutes, doesn't get the 90 all the time. Ceiling still relatively low because he plays for Southampton. Fatau for Leicester and Buonanotte, they could be very similar, playing the majority of minutes, relatively low ceilings because of the team they're playing for, but decent waiver picks. So if we wanted to add in the waiver picks to this section, if you want a low level, a low ceiling but nailed player, and McNeil, Onana, Diaz, Fatau, Buonanotte, good picks. If I was picking out of these 5 players and I had to pick 2 of them, I'd pick McNeil, and I'd probably pick and going with fixtures as well. You'd have to go Onana. Already done very, very well. But the other 3, Diaz, Fatau, and Benanante, not bad options either. I'd probably put Benanante over Fatau because of his positioning. And then Diaz, although Southampton have been very poor, still a good pick and picking up some good areas. But they're never going to, as Micah Richards would say, burst onto the scene. But they will settle the ship in your team. In the next section, we have a large contingent of players that are definitely not nailed for their teams, but will get maybe 60 to 70% of minutes. Some maybe less, some maybe slightly more, but they're right bang in the middle. Some towards the high end of the ceiling, some towards the low. So in this section, again, we have players that might seem very exciting and will return very well some days, but they are a slight rotation risk. Let's take a couple of examples. Right in the middle, I'm looking at Kulusevski. Kulusevski has probably a higher ceiling than previous players we talked about, Dwight McNeil, because of the team he plays for and his positioning. It's never going to be crazy high, but he's a big rotation risk. Right beside him would be someone like Brennan Johnson. Again, he's on a lot of waivers, played some okay minutes, but neither of these players are going to nail down a position, or at least that we can see, especially with Solanke coming back. They're okay to have in your team if you have space for them, and they could win you a game week on any given day. Other players, less minutes, right, and slightly less ceiling, maybe. Again, this is all based off my understanding, statistics, and previous minutes. The likes of Nkunku, Felix, Martinelli could be bunched up together, slightly less minutes, or maybe similar minutes, and a decent ceiling. Nkunku might be slightly higher because he could have penalties if Cole Palmer doesn't play, but he has to be on the pitch for him to score. So players that are kind of like seem like great picks, a Martinelli, a Felix, and Kunku, but in reality, their ceilings okay, their minutes are okay. Are they ever going to win you a draft? You can't have, and I suppose it's a good way to look at this little cohort of people. If you have two or three of these in your team, you're probably going to struggle because what are the chances of all three of those players starting on any given game week? Other players that we could talk about are Jacob Ramsey, who probably will get the start in game week 4. Okay ceiling, good team, good fixtures, but very, very injury prone, and definitely hasn't a position nailed down in that team. Down the list, further down the minutes, would be Chiesa. He probably has a decent midfield, decent ceiling, probably in and around the Johnson, Kulusevski, maybe the upper end of this cohort. But would it be realistic to say that he gets 50 to 60% of minutes this season? 60% of minutes for me is a lot for a brand new player playing on the left hand side, or the right hand side, taking either Mo Salah's or Diaz's spot. They're probably going to be the number one choice. How many minutes are left for him to play in the Premier League? Could get more than that as a whole, but in the Premier League, a lot of people are asking about Chiesa. I just don't see it. I just don't see it as an FPL pick right now. With, again, his ceiling's pretty high, so it's good. It plays for Liverpool on the left hand side, very attacking side. But his minutes are always going to be at risk. If you can afford, fair play. The one or two players that I would pick out of this cohort are Trossard and Barnes. I think Trossard will probably get maybe 60 to 70% of minutes for the rest of the season. Absolutely perfect for me. He has a very good ceiling. Plays for Arsenal, will win most games, will have most possession, will have a lot of chances, and he's an excellent finisher. Even if he doesn't play them minutes, we know what he can do. So it's not as big of a risk as taking maybe an Nkunku or a Felix. Even if Trossard and Nkunku and Felix play the same minutes, you're probably going to back Trossard to get more points. So in this case, maybe the risk of minutes is worth it. For me, a more solid pick would be Barnes, and that has come to the forefront over the last couple of weeks. If you look at his minutes, he probably hasn't played as much as this cohort here, but looks like he is going to make his way into that team, and push a Jacob Murphy out of it. Barnes, I think, is too good to leave on the bench consistently for Newcastle. They're a decent side. He's a decent, probably not as high as a Trossard or a Johnson, um, in terms of ceiling, but probably more minutes and probably has a highest probability of getting in there on a consistent basis. So if you're looking for a waiver this week, maybe I'll be looking at Trossard, Barnes. Um, if you want to take the chance on Johnson or Kulusevski, maybe. Ramsey as a low level, you'll probably get him in larger size leagues, could be worth the punt this week. And finally, players that are higher on the minutes axis and slightly higher, if not similar, on the ceiling axis. Let's start with someone who could have been in that previous group. Callum Hudson-Odoi will play again 60, 70, maybe 80% of minutes. Decent ceiling, nice pick. Alanga, very similar, but slightly up the minutes axis. If we're looking at players that are good waivers, Sterling is very, very hot on people's list. And I went against him in a lot of messages that I sent to people, but with the sending off of Rice, with the injury of Marino, there is a possibility that Sterling does play false nine, play on the wing, and does get more minutes than I had originally thought. So again, as a high upside midfielder that will get rotated, fair. A lot of people have sent me their teams, and their teams does they suit getting a Sterling in there because their other four midfielders are absolutely nailed, and he's probably one of the highest upsides for the best teams on the waiver. So I can understand it from that perspective. Again, if you are battling with players that are getting whipped every day or they're not starting, Sterling mightn't be the best pick, but definitely does have a nice ceiling. and will play a chunk of minutes. Okay, he's going to be like a Trossard of the past. Semenyo is 100% nailed, but I had a long conversation with a dude about Semenyo's output, and he has the most shots of anyone so far after 3 game weeks. That is not going to stay the way it is. Great pick, no doubt. Very talented players, but he is going to be slightly overvalued right now. I'm not saying to trade him, but I'm saying if you can get someone like I'm looking at here, a Kudos for him, I would rather Kudos. Kudos hasn't played his preferred position, but he can play anywhere. And if he does go into a slightly more free role, even playing false nine, I think he's going to be amazing. I think he's unbelievably talented, and West Ham have a decent run of set of fixtures. So Kudos could be a trading option. Bernardo Silva, I talked about him earlier. Great pick. 390 minutes. It's not going to stay that way forever, but he doesn't need. If he gets 60 or 70 minutes every game, that's plenty. Morgan Gibbs White is nailed for Forest, and he has a load of routes to points. He's right in the medium category. He can return 8, 9, 10 points any given day. He's never going to score a hat trick, but he has a nice ceiling, especially with some set pieces and possible penalties, but more than likely not. He could be on some set pieces. Hasn't been taking corners so far this year, but decent player right in the middle of those players that are nailed. Up on the top right hand side, we have Mbuemo and Mitoma. Mitoma, slightly less nailed than Mbuemo because we know there's so many wingers at Brighton, but nearly nailed, and has a really good ceiling. Fantastic player and can score on any given day. Doesn't matter who he's playing. Mbuemo, again, nailed. Penalties, really, really good output and a really, really high ceiling, as we saw in game week 3. There is a load of more midfielders that you could put up in this really nailed high ceiling category, but they're going to be hard to get. I think these players, Matoma and Buemo, Kudos, they're going to be very attainable players over the course of the season. Minte could be up there, slightly down the nailed list, but really, really good player. I'd probably put him in around the Bernardo Silva category, we'll say. So loads of options. Players that I'd be looking at for the long term. Alanga's an easy one to get over the line in maybe a trade. I like Bernardo Silva as a settled player. Kudos, I really, really like Kudos. Obviously, Mbuemo and Mitona are top class. But if you're looking for a high upside player that could fit into your team if you're settled, Sterling over the next couple of game weeks might make a good impact fairly quick for Arsenal. Couple of defender pickups now, and Brighton have 2 very good fixtures in a row, Ipswich and Forest, both at home. That man we talked about last week is Stupinan came on. You should have seen his heat map. He was practically a left winger. Not nailed, but definitely worth a pickup and take the risk that he doesn't get in there. Because if he does, and I think he will, he is indisposable. He's such a good FPL asset, and his positioning, as I said, is just elite for wing backs. Van Hecke and Dunk, 2 great options. I looked at all the stats. I think the only reason I go over Dunk is obviously the aerial ability, and he had 1 key pass so far. Van Hecke had none. Um, Either of those as a pickup for Ipswich and Forest, brilliant assets. And then Fabian Schär is back this game week after that red card. 2 very good fixtures in a row. Wolves away at Fulham at home. So he might go under the radar because he's well down the list with a lovely -2 points. And then Nedeljevic, who didn't get in, didn't start the last day. Bogard started. Now Bogard could be the other best option. Probably is. So either Nedeljevic or Bogard as that Konza replacement. But I could see Nedeljkovic getting in that right back position where Konza actually filled into and Bogard plays centre back. So that could be an option. I just like the more attacking players. Bogard played 78 minutes. Okay game, but I do think there is a room for this dude in Villa's defence. Everton, Wolves, and then Ipswich. 3 great fixtures, but the problem is that he's not necessarily nailed. But if he is, great option and will be well down the waiver pile. On to our more punty defenders, short term, but when I think about it, the 2 boys I have on the right here, Lacroix and Chalobah, could be good long term. My issue is I don't know which one's going to start. Gay is going to be nailed down for Palace. Chris Richards is playing very well, and I can't see him getting knocked out of there too easily. LaCroix hasn't played in the Premier League and Chalobah has. It's the only thing that tips it in Chalobah's favour. I have been talking to a couple of Palace fans. They reckon LaCroix is going to be massive for them. So maybe he gets in quicker than Chalobah. But they play Leicester at home. So if you want to take the chance on LaCroix as the next centre back for Palace, Leicester is a great game to start. Whether he starts this game week or not, I don't know. Um, if we're looking at a bit more solid and definitely nailed, Davis of Ipswich, it's just the fact that he plays for Ipswich. And the fixtures aren't even that great. If you are getting Davis, you're looking for attacking returns. So you kind of have to play him maybe as one of your three defenders and hope for the best. Maybe a Southampton, maybe at Brighton. You never know. Has got an assist already this season, so maybe he could be on to get, like, as I said at the start in my previous podcast, the pre-draft podcast, if he got 8 to 10, wouldn't that be unbelievable? He's going well. Maybe he gets the lower end of that, the 8. But Davis, for short term, or maybe as a rotating defender, could be a great pickup. Finishing off with our forwards, as always, 3 potential pickups. One of them who we recommended last week, and bang, Delap, good option, relatively nailed, big lad up top. As I said, they have some okay fixtures, Ipswich. If you are in a large size league, you're looking for a striker, maybe he's the man. Uh, Enjoy of Everton, I think, will get another start next week, played well, and will work his way into that struggling Everton side. But again, probably have to go with Delap over him, mainly because of the minutes. But on top, I would have Nketiah of Palace. Mateta is a big risk, but Edward is gone, so it's one less person to worry about. I think he will get a nice few minutes. I think he's the best ability of the 3 that I've mentioned. And if he does get consistent minutes, the goals will come. So if you are struggling, don't worry. There might be a striker on the horizon. That is it for game week 4 preview. I know a lot of people have sent in messages. We've answered a lot of them on Instagram. But if you want any recommendations or questions or trades answered, make sure to either comment below or send them into our WhatsApp or Instagram, and we'll try and answer them as best possible. Thank you so much for listening, as always, watching, whatever you do, subscribe, like, all that crack. FPL Draft Joe out. Boom.